have cameras?
Okay, we're going to get right into it.
Okay.
We really want to use this time in the beginning to have you explain global warming in the
Okay.
simplest terms so that we can air it and everyone will understand.
Right.
So what causes global warming? What is it in its simplest terms? What causes it? What is it?
Well, the Earth has a natural greenhouse effect. In fact, we're about 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer thanks to those good guys, water vapor and carbon dioxide and methane, what we call greenhouse gases, trapping heat. That's the good part of the story. The problem is that humans are competing with nature in that when we use our tailpipes and our smokestacks to put our wastes into the atmosphere as if it's some kind of unpriced sewer, we're adding to that amount of greenhouse gases that's natural, unnatural stuff, mostly carbon dioxide, methane, chemicals that nobody's ever seen before, chlorofluorocarbons, which also affect ozone. And when they build up, they trap extra heat. It's like you had the window in your car halfway up and the car's a little hotter than outside. That's the greenhouse effect. So what we're doing is cranking the window up a little bit more, making it hotter inside. And that's not controversial. That's well understood. We know we've increased carbon dioxide by about 30-35%, methane 150%, added gases that never existed before. We know they trap heat, and the Earth is warmer. All of that goes together and makes global warming not only a reality, but a concern for the future because we're continuing doing what we're doing at an accelerating rate.
So what does warming mean? Is it 1 degree, 2 degrees, and where is that warming? Is it in the high atmosphere, in the low atmosphere?
The Earth is warmed up near the surface about 0.7 of a degree Celsius, something like a degree Fahrenheit in the last century. And some people have said, well, the Earth is warmed and cooled before. This could just be natural. And in fact, some element of it must be natural. Changes in the energy output of the sun, the internal flipping of energy between the oceans and the atmosphere. But in the last 30 years, it's taken a jump up that's not apparent in anything in the last several thousand years. This part of global warming we think we have a significant impact on. Now, only a degree, people say. That doesn't sound like much. On the other hand, the difference between an ice age, when there was ice down to Manhattan Island, and we could not inhabit the Earth with anywhere near the population we now have, and the present is less than 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That is in the forecast for 100 to 150 years from now if we continue dumping our wastes in the atmosphere. We've already gone 1/10 of the way. A degree is not insignificant. Sea levels have risen something like 6 to 10 inches. Mountain glaciers are melting all around the world. Greenland and the western Antarctica are shrinking. Hurricanes are more intense. And that's just 1 degree. And if we're very lucky, we'll get 1 degree more. If we're unlucky, we're going to get 10 more. And that catastrophic outcome is why many of us are concerned we have to do something about this problem.
So is global warming happening right now? I mean, is it happening, or are we still waiting for it to happen?
Well, despite what you hear from those famous climate scientists, Professors Limbaugh and Crichton, global warming is a fact. It's happening. The Earth is a little more than a degree Fahrenheit warmer than it was at the surface. And we know that we're at least 50% responsible for it, and probably more than that for the warming of the last few decades, when we've broken all the records over the last 1,000 years. Did I answer everything?
Yeah.
In that question? I thought there was something else.
Is it happening now?
Oh, yeah, okay. So global warming itself is a fact. The tougher question is how much of it is nature rolling snake eyes and giving us an unusual warming trend, and how much of it is due to us. And the vast bulk of the knowledgeable scientific community, the people who study and do the research in climate, suggest that nature may have been part of it up through the middle of the 20th century, but that since the 1970s, the vast bulk of the warming we've had since, in which most of the record heat years have occurred, is due to us, our dumping of wastes in the atmosphere.
So you talked about different degrees. What's a good case of global warming and what's a bad case of global warming? I mean, what will happen if it's 10 degrees higher? What will happen if it's only, let's say, 2 degrees higher?
Well, the media is filled with these polar extremes. Somebody from a deep ecology group saying global warming is the end of the world. It's going to drive 50% of species to extinction, super hurricanes and so forth. And then somebody from an enterprise institute or who makes the monster cars or sells you coal, the things that cause the problem. And they'll tell you CO2 is a good thing. I mean, it's a fertilizer. It makes green plants grow better. And they'll tell you, and warming of the Arctic is a good thing. The shipping industry will be able to go straight across the melted Arctic instead of having to go all the way around, and that'll save money. Well, they'll forget to tell you some stuff too, which is when you fertilize green plants, you make them grow faster, but you make the weeds grow faster as well as the good stuff, and you don't know who's going to win the battle of what happens in our ecosystems. The second thing is that CO2 gets absorbed in the oceans, and CO2 is a weak acid, right? The thing you drink in your Coke, right? The carbonic acid is a little bit acidic. But when you put that in the ocean, if we double carbon dioxide, and we're on that track to do it by the middle of this century, you're going to make the ocean substantially more acidic. If we triple it, we're going to make it so much more acidic, it'll be difficult to have coral reefs and clams and other kinds of calcium-shelled creatures because they'll dissolve in the acid. So there's a real dark side to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and oceans without climate. Now, when you add these greenhouse gases, they also trap heat near the Earth's surface. They're partly responsible for the 1 degree Fahrenheit warming we've seen, especially in the last 50 years. And it's projected to be 2 to 5 times more than that this century, and maybe 10 times more than that if we don't get off our addiction to fossil fuels. And that is going to require substantial change. Otherwise, we risk these very large outcomes. Did I miss anything?
Yes. There's so many tangents that I'm going to nail, but I'm just going to go through what I have here because I want that.
Because the questions you're asking have enough multi-parts that I sometimes forget to handle one. Just come back and re-ask it.
Can you get any more detail? I mean, we
About?
really want to blow out the negative scenario. Like, what are the three scariest things that you talk about like with severe global warming, and when might that all happen? Some of your models.
So the optimists say, well, the north gets warmer and the sea ice melts and the shipping can go out there. And they say that CO2 is a fertilizer of green plants. They forget to tell you it fertilizes weeds. They forget to tell you if you wipe out the Arctic sea ice, not only do you radically change the climate, but you drive cultures like the Inuits to extinction. They had nothing to do with creating global warming. Their economy isn't big, so they don't weigh in cost-benefit analysis. But in fact, is it ethical for us to get richer, faster, and only slightly faster than if we were more careful in our use of energy, and then drive cultures to extinction? Those are the downsides. Then there are things that directly affect us and already are doing it. The single most obvious one is hurricanes in the Gulf and in the Atlantic. We all know what makes a hurricane strong: warm water. That's why we get them in the summer instead of in the winter. So if you add heat to the oceans, and we've added about half a degree C, something like 1F, to the Gulf and to the Atlantic, and also in the Pacific from global warming. Now, over the last 30 years, 2 independent studies have shown not that there are an increased number of hurricanes. There's no evidence we've changed the number. That's controlled by natural processes. But there's a lot of evidence that the very strongest storms, at categories 4 and 5, have increased substantially in the last 30 years in both hemispheres, coincident with the warming and coincident with the theory which says warm water intensifies the power of hurricanes. So nobody can know in one case, like Katrina, were we responsible for 1 foot of its 15-foot storm surge or 5? If it was 1, then our impact was minor but still noticeable. If it was 5, then we broke the levees. We're not going to know that yet, but these things are going to happen more and more frequently as we continue to press the planet and continue to use it as a sewer to dump our wastes.
So can we go back to the energy sources that cause global warming? Just for the camera and for simplicity's sake, what causes it? I mean, what is the fuel that causes global warming?
There's a natural greenhouse on the Earth due to water vapor and carbon dioxide, methane, so-called heat-trapping greenhouse gases. When we burn fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, when we cut down forests and take the carbon in those trees and dump it in the atmosphere, what we're doing is we're competing with nature in the processes that put these greenhouse gas heat trappers in the atmosphere. And that competition is now getting to be noticeable. There's over 30% more carbon dioxide. There's 150% more methane. And those two alone are trapping enough heat that they're probably responsible for a good fraction of the 1 degree Fahrenheit warming that we've seen. Now, we are projected to increase our population from 6 billion to maybe 9. We are projected to get 5 times richer in the next 100 years. And we're not working very fast at replacing the more polluting energy systems like burning coal and oil and gas and our deforestation with renewables and with efficiency. And if we stay on that business as usual path, we're going to double or triple carbon dioxide and then have warming many, many times what we've already experienced. And that means the intensified hurricanes, drought and flood cycles will also intensify. Probably wildfires, particularly in places like California, will become more severe. And while there'll be some benefits in longer growing seasons in high latitudes, I think they'll be more than offset by the loss of food production and the stresses, particularly in the populated developing world, which is already too hot for optimal food production, and getting hotter is certainly not going to be good for them.
So what alternatives are there? You mentioned them in passing, but we're dependent on fossil fuels right now. So what is our transition technology?
Well, fossil fuels are a little bit like a social drug. We're addicted to carbon, and we're not going to get off it anytime soon. You can't just go cold turkey because that's economically catastrophic. So you have to have a transition strategy on the time frame of a generation or two to unhook ourselves. What that means is investing in the development of alternatives like solar and wind. Some people even think nuclear. I'm waiting for nuclear to be proved fully safe and cheap enough to compete. I wouldn't rule it off the table ideologically, but I don't think it has much of a chance till it gets its costs down. And then there are some very important things we need to do. We have to use energy more efficiently. Do we have to have an 8,000-pound utility vehicle to drive to the supermarket or commute with a single driver on a freeway when we could be using hybrids, or even better, what we call plug-in hybrids, where you can actually plug them in at night when the electricity demand is low? And that's the equivalent of getting 100 miles a gallon. We have the technological capacity already to think and buy our way out of a lot of the problem, but without incentives to charge people for their tailpipe and smokestack emissions. The same way I have to pay to have my garbage collected. Why, if I have to pay to have my garbage collected, is my atmospheric garbage free? This is not preserving the free market, as is alleged in the West Wing and by some members of Congress. What this really is doing is subsidizing the existing interests in coal, oil, gas, autos, and mining. And this is a subsidy, and the only way we're going to start reversing direction and inventing those technologies that we need is if we charge people the actual cost of what we're doing and put a fee for dumping in the atmosphere.
In terms of, just 1 second, in terms of the energy sources still, how much oil do we have left? I mean, do we have time to transition, and how much does it cost? I mean, how much cheap oil is left, and where do we go from there if we don't have enough solar and we haven't really subsidized other forms of energy?
People often say we're very close to the oil peak. That's when we have a maximum production and we start down. Once that happens, the price goes up. We'll start running out of oil. We'll have gas lines. In fact, we had an oil peak in the United States decades ago. So how is it that we still can support an increased habit of using oil and all the large clunky vehicles that we drive whose gas mileage is worse than it used to be? That's because we import oil. And that can't go on forever either. That can't go on forever either. So somewhere along the line, we're going to have to start switching. But we may not have to switch off oil. There are substitutes. There are oil sands in Canada and oil shales in the US. These are rocks and sands, which if you apply a lot of energy to them, you can actually squeeze oil out of them. The trouble is they'll dump more carbon dioxide than burning the oil directly. So while they may be a backstop from the point of view of economists thinking, oh, well, we'll have oil for a long, long time, they are not safe. They have very high emissions and very, very significant environmental damages. That's not the right direction to go. The direction to go is to start becoming decoupled from our dependence on oil through efficient transportation, better insulated houses, and the development of renewable alternatives like solar and wind and biomass, and getting those to become the major part of the market using efficiency as the transition. It's not going to happen overnight, but it should have started 30 years ago. And we have right now in the White House and in many members of Congress people trying to delay it further, which to me is ultimately irrational, both for our national security and our environmental protection.
Why do you think they're delaying it?
Well, the people who are delaying it have one of two motives. They're either ideologically passionate about protecting individual entrepreneurial rights. That is, we don't want to discourage anybody from exploring for oil, from mining from coal, from building a car that makes them the most money. What they forget is that there are social costs of those things and that they're not sustainable. And if we keep ratcheting up our demand and we keep having bigger and bigger cars and unsustainable production, one day we're going to end up with gas lines as bad or worse than those we had in the 1970s after the oil embargo. It almost happened after Katrina and Rita hit the Gulf Coast refineries. If we continue to increase demand, if world supply peaks and starts down, and at the same time everything is going up in what we use, there's going to be a crash. And it isn't even the price that's going to drive it. Let's face it, gas went from $1.50 a gallon to nearly $3 within 1 year, within 2005. People paid the price. What will really get us out of those clunking gas guzzlers is waiting in line. That's what will make a difference. It's coming, and I would rather head it off at the pass, slow down, reduce our dependence on foreign oil, reduce our need to spend blood and treasure defending the lines of supply, not have to go into pristine wildlife refuges to get a small amount of oil, which we can overwhelm with energy efficiency and then eventually with renewable alternatives.
What do you want to ask? What the true cost of oil would be, like true cost economics. Like
Oh, okay.
What the true cost would be if you incorporated global warming in its price on the planet.
When people oppose the idea of climate control, say taxing the emissions of fossil fuels is an unfair interference in the free market, they forget that those emissions, which make the planet warmer, cause sea levels to rise, hurricanes to be more intense. Those are real costs. The cost of the destruction of New Orleans, even though we were only part of that story, was a real cost. You can't say that the price of gasoline or coal is just extraction and transport and profit. It's also the side effects of dumping it in the atmosphere. They are not currently internalized. That is part of the price structure. Therefore, we have the wrong market signal. We are telling people to use more stuff than they should be because the price is too low. That cannot be fixed by any form of market mechanism inside of the community that produces the energy. It requires the government. The government has to say, our job is protecting the society, protecting nature, and protecting the commons. Therefore, we're going to level the playing field by putting a fee on oil and gas and coal emissions. Now, the $1.50 rise that we saw that had nothing to do with environment in gas prices from beginning of 2005 to the end, you would have had to tax carbon at the rate of about $270 a ton to get that kind of price rise. Our president went to the G8 meeting in the summer of 2005, and George W. Bush said that if we signed the Kyoto Protocol to protect climate, it would have, quote, bankrupt America, or some very similar phrase. Well, the projections from the economists of how much Kyoto would have cost is maybe $100 a ton of carbon equivalent tax. We had a $270 a ton rise just from gouging by oil companies and shortage in supply. It did not wreck the economy, Mr. President. That is not true, yet you and members of Congress who are opposed to climate policy continue to repeat this mantra that is demonstrably wrong. But we need it more than in just gasoline. We don't need the 270 just in gasoline. We also need it in coal. We need it in embedded products. We need people to realize that they're actually going to get a very big payback by putting in double pane, low E, that means high efficiency windows, that compact fluorescence in the houses, that building codes with tougher standards for insulation have very fast paybacks. Less than 10 years, better than anybody can safely get in the bank or by buying government bonds. And it's just foolish not to be doing this, but unfortunately we need legislation. Now, California has had that legislation, and amazingly enough, over the last 30 years, the amount of carbon dioxide emitted per person in California has been flat the whole time, despite the economy going like this. Our emissions have gone up because our population has increased, but they've gone up less than any other state. Which state has the largest emissions per capita? Texas. Now, let me answer your other question. I don't think I did.
No,
Say it again.
No.
The average person, your question,
Yeah,
right?
the average person
Okay.
picking up garbage. I'm a homeowner. I pay
Isn't taxing tailpipe emissions an unwarranted interference in the free market? I've heard that from many senators, particularly from fossil fuel states or from auto industry states. And my answer is very simple. I'm a regular guy, and I have a can of garbage every week, and they come to my house and they charge me $4 to pick it up. If I put out a second one, they charge me only $2 more because they're already there. Why? Because there's labor, there's the truck, there's landfill. So why is it, what is the free market logic that anybody can legitimately defend which says that my tailpipe or your smokestack should be dumping garbage in the atmosphere for free? That's not a free market position. That's a subsidy to the status quo imposed by the Congress and the federal government in order to protect existing industries and their campaign contributors. Why do people have some doubts or super worries about climate change? The word we scientists use is feedbacks. Feedback means that you're pushing the system either further in the direction you're going or you're holding it back. A negative feedback is like your own body. If you get hot, you sweat, and that cools you back down. It's a thermostat. You get cold, you shiver, it warms you back up. A positive feedback means it amplifies you in the direction you're going. And nature has both positive and negative feedbacks, and we're always fighting over which ones are going to win. I'll give you a negative feedback. If you add CO2 to the atmosphere, it means that green plants are going to take it out faster. That means the buildup of the CO2 will be less. I'll give you a positive feedback. If you make the Earth hotter by adding CO2 to the atmosphere, trapping heat, it makes the soils warmer, so the bacteria in the soils are going to produce CO2 and methane, both greenhouse gases, faster. That's a positive amplifying feedback. The scientific community cannot sort out the winners and the losers between the positive and the negative feedbacks, which is why when we talk about the future, it's always in a range. If we're lucky, we warm up another 2 degrees. If we're unlucky, we warm up 10. Another 2 is not trivial. Another 10 is catastrophic. So we're in that range, and I don't take a lot of comfort that we may only warm up another 2 degrees, and I'm very concerned about the possibility of warming up 10 with super hurricanes, forest fires, droughts, floods, melted ice sheets, rising sea level, and displaced plants and animals with substantial extinctions. Even if there are only 10% chance, that's very concerning. Economist said to me at a talk I gave the other day at dinner, if it's only a 10% chance of the truly catastrophic outcomes, you don't really seriously want to rewrite the basis for progress and prosperity in the industrial world by slowing down the use of fossil fuels, do you, for only a 10% chance? And I said, you know, Joe, we're eating salmon that night. There's only a 10% chance of salmonella in your salmon, so of course you're going to eat it. And when you fly home tomorrow, there's only a 1/10% chance that the rivets are going to pop off the airplane, so of course you're going to get in it. None of us would do that. Those risks are way too high when we're talking about the planetary life support system. Most of us buy fire insurance when there's less than a 1% chance our house is going to burn down. And now these people want us to be 99% sure in environmental science that there are guaranteed catastrophic risks, and they're willing to commit the future to a substantial probability of unsustainable practice until we're sure, because what they really want to do is maintain market share for their special interests. I should pick up on this theme of, but you can't rule out that there'll be benefits and all that, because I don't know if I did that enough.
Let's not go there yet.
All right.
Let's go
Okay.
back to
I just don't want to forget.
No, we won't.
We haven't done neoliberalism either.
No, right.
I've written that down.
We'll get
I
that.
need to get some of what we need.
Okay, go, keep going.
We've got, okay, I'm just gonna go on then. What, I want to talk about coal gasification. We're talking about alternative energy. A lot of people are talking about coal gasification. Can you tell us about what that is and if that's a viable alternative?
There was a lot of excitement about hydrogen because hydrogen fuel cells in cars would have very, very high efficiency. It would also be very low polluting of the conventional air pollutants, which hurt people's lungs and send people with asthma into the hospital. So that all sounds great, but what people forget is that hydrogen is not an energy source, it's an energy carrier. You've got to make it. And if you make it from electricity generated by a coal plant, you might as well just use the electricity directly. It's even worse than nothing because you lose some energy in making the hydrogen. So the key is, how are you going to do it? And one of the suggestions is, let's keep the coal industry alive and also not have climate change. Now, how are you going to do that? Because coal is mostly carbon and a little bit of hydrogen. The idea is you take the coal, you go through a chemical process that strips methane out. Methane is more hydrogen than carbon. But in the process of doing that, you dump a lot of carbon. Where are you going to put it? So the idea is, if you put it in the atmosphere, you might as well just burn the coal. That's worse than nothing. Put it underground. And they call that carbon capture and sequestration. I think it's a good idea. Whether it's feasible at the level of 1 trillion tons over the next century is anybody's guess, and is going to be a major research and development topic. And I wouldn't plan the future that it will work. What I'd do is I'd say, let's hope we can make it work. Meanwhile, let's cut down our appetite for the stuff. But in the meanwhile, what would you do? You'd take the carbon out of the coal, and you'd have natural gas. So you could burn the natural gas cleaner or put it in cars. You can even use it in fuel cells in cars. Or you can go one step further. You can throw the carbon away in the natural gas and take the hydrogen out and use that for even more efficient use in cars. It's expensive, but it may be feasible. But then you have more CO2. So you, again, either dump it back in the atmosphere, in which case you might as well have just used the methane in the first place, or you put it underground. If it works, that's the big question. If it works. We know it works in small quantities, millions of tons, because the oil industry has shown that. We don't know if it's going to work in the kind of quantities that are projected for this century, which is 1 trillion tons. And that's the big question. And the risk is, do we want to commit the future to the hope that it will work? Or do we want to try to slow the system down, do the research, and then only adjust back up that massive use of coal when we're sure that it can be done economically and safely? That's my own personal values. I don't like taking risks with the planetary life support system, but we certainly should explore that avenue. One final thing about it. Some people have said, well, why don't we just dump the carbon dioxide we take out of the coal in making natural gas, or even better, making hydrogen, and put it in the oceans? Because that's where it would have ended up anyway in the atmosphere. It just would have ended up there 300 years from now after we had a massive global warming. The trouble is, when you put carbon dioxide in the oceans, you make the oceans more acidic, and you threaten a lot of marine life like coral reefs and clams and phytoplankton. And recent experiments have shown that we cannot double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, or let alone triple, which is where we're going on business as usual, and not expect dramatic ecological damage in the ocean just from the acidification. This stuff has got to stop being dumped in the air. Either it has to go underground, or we have to get off the coal standard and oil and onto other forms of safer renewable energy.
So why doesn't everyone believe in global warming? I want to drill in more about the 10% problem you talk about and the motivations for detractors. But why is there opposition to global warming?
It's amazing to me as a scientist that people often in the political or the media debate refer to whether they, quote, believe in global warming as if somehow this is an object of faith as opposed to an object of evidence. And we have just legion amount of evidence about global warming, but we're scientists. And scientists are honor-bound to tell the truth. And the truth is, nothing is fully understood. So what happens is, those people who want to be in climate denial, I call them climate monkeys, hear no, see no, and speak no climate, because they don't like the idea of public control on private activities, they're ideologues, or they're protecting a particular industry like coal or the manufacture of large, heavy, gas-guzzling cars. What they're going to do is they're going to watch the scientific community, which in its honesty has this large umbrella of information. And out here is really, really bad stuff, and over here is not so bad, or we don't know too much. So the deep ecology groups grab the really bad stuff and pretend that's the only outcome. And then the opponents who don't want to regulate their own industries, or who are ideologically opposed to any government action, they're going to grab the unknowns, and they're each going to inflate them to the central truth. Most people are very used to dealing with uncertainty. We can take the climate problem and we can rank it into things that are very well established, things that are established but incomplete, and things that are speculative. In the public political debate, let me say that again. Some scientists are amazed that in the media debate and in front of Congress we hear about people who I believe in or I don't believe in global warming, as if this were somehow some object of religion as opposed to based in evidence. And scientists look at evidence. And when scientists look, there are always uncertainties. So that allows those people who don't want to believe in global warming, either because they ideologically don't like the idea of government control on private industries, or happen to be in those industries and don't want to see the price of their activity, like producing coal, go up, they're a vested interest in denial. We sometimes call them the climate monkeys. They see no and hear no and speak no climate because it's not good for business or it's counter ideology. In science, we have a very different ideology. You tell the whole story. You bring in the things that really worry you, what's well established, and you separate that from things we have a pretty good idea about but aren't fully sure, and those things that are speculative. In the public debate, the speculative gets mixed up with well established, sometimes on purpose in order to confuse people into thinking, well, we haven't fully solved the problem, so let's wait until we fully solve the problem before we do anything about it. That's just a ploy. In no other form of life do we do that. In medical decisions, in business decisions, in strategic policy, we hedge on hunches. We buy fire insurance with only a 1 chance in 100 or less that the house will burn down, and they're telling us we should be 99.9% objectively sure before we do anything about global warming. That's completely inconsistent with how policy is done in the risk management world. And it's done generally for ideological reasons. It is also true there's uncertainty. So what do we know for sure? We know that the Earth is about 1 degree Fahrenheit warmer than a century ago. We know there's 30% more CO2, there's 150% more methane. There are other pollutants that we put in. We know for sure that we're responsible for those increases in those pollutants. And we have a very, very good idea, very high probability, not 100%, but certainly better than 98 in my view, that at least some of the recent warming can be attributed to our dumping our wastes in the atmosphere. That having been said, we can go beyond it and say, since we're continuing to dump at an increased rate, it's very likely the warming we've seen will at least be twice as much and maybe 3 to 10 times as much if we don't get off this continuous injection into the atmosphere of our tailpipe emissions and our continuous deforestation. Those two things together drive it. But what do we know about what's going to happen to rainfall in Iowa? Actually, very little. We know a lot about temperature. We know a lot about temperature's effects, but the distribution of precipitation we know less. The more specific you get at any one place in any one time, the less we know. So scientists have a global frame. They think about this as global long term. They say this is unprecedented relative to geologic rates and that this is very concerning, but all politics is local. People want to know what's going to happen in the next 5 years in my backyard. And that's more difficult to say with high confidence than that there'll be global scale things. So people exploit the legitimate uncertainty about regional effects and then try to pretend that there's no global effect, which is simply not true. That's a distortion. It's kind of a legal trick that trial lawyers often use to divert us away from the basic issue. The basic issue is we dump our waste in the atmosphere. It's building up. The buildup is continuing. That will continue to increase the already observed heat. We know we're part of the story. We're going to be larger. There are potential catastrophic outcomes. And no amount of ducking and covering and uncertainty is going to make those basic facts go away.
These people have children, the people that are detracting. What is their motivation? It's got to be pretty strong. And who are these people that are detracting? I mean, because we're all on the same planet. What's going on with these people?
Some of my students really can't understand the objection of the so-called contrarians, the ones who just absolutely deny that there's any serious climate change or that until we're sure we don't do anything. And they wonder, how can they have any ethics? Don't they have kids? I mean, if they look in the mirror, is there an ethical person looking back at them? And I think that's a legitimate question. But we also have to recognize that there's a second way of seeing the world. And if you see the world as a consumer, then you have a different view. You say, well, in the process of my getting richer and increasing our numbers and using the cheapest available energy like coal and maybe even oil shale after we start running out of oil, it won't be cheap, but we'll have it, that's going to accelerate rapidly the pressure on nature. But they'll say, but we're leaving a legacy of wealth and infrastructure to posterity, and they'll be so rich they'll be able to figure out how to deal with it. And other people say, wait a minute, we're not just leaving a legacy of wealth and infrastructure. We're also leaving a legacy of biotic impoverishment, extinctions, and having to deal with souped-up hurricanes, with increased droughts and floods, fires, heat waves like that killed 30,000 people in Europe, increasing year after year. And that is not sustainable, and that is not moral. And therefore, the debate is between what's more moral, leaving people richer and they'll figure out what to do about the environment they've degraded, or letting the environment be protected. The funny thing is, it is not anywhere near as stark as they will let you know, because study after study has shown with the economy that our growth rate, it's about 2% per year, is so large that the costs of fixing the climate problem through the deployment and development of renewables and efficiency and so forth, even though it would be counted in the trillions of dollars over a century, is a very small fraction of the growth rate of our own GDP. In fact, calculation after calculation has shown that if we spent $300 or $400 a ton on emissions of carbon, which would pretty much wipe out the coal industry and transform us away from oil and dramatically reduce global warming, that our president, who said this would bankrupt the economy, and others are fundamentally wrong. Because what the models show is that that would cost us, that trillions of dollars, which sounds unimaginably expensive, in the future, a delay of only 1 to 2 years in being 500% richer. In other words, if we have climate policy and we reduce the risks, we're 500% richer per person all around the world in the standard projection in 2102 instead of 2100 without climate policy. Seems to me that's a very cheap insurance premium to help protect the life support system of the Earth.
Why is it difficult for people to understand? You've often talked about the 10% problem, and there's always somebody on, like Pat Michaels or what you call
I can talk about that.
The junk science, and why do they get equal time, or Michael Crichton? I mean, why is it that, that there is a debate in this country? And anyway.
Many of my European colleagues are just amazed at the climate debate in the United States, where one day a report written by 100 scientists has been reviewed 3 times by peer review and has come out with carefully hedged statements. And it says there's a serious problem, although there are some uncertainties, but we are nervous about taking that risk. And then they put on 2 PhDs funded by the coal and the oil industry who then say it's not true, as if somehow this is journalistic balance, and the average person says, well, if the PhDs don't know, how do I know? And they just wait and see. I can promise you that the 2 guys who said that are very well paid to create the impression that they have equal status at the bargaining table with the 100 scientist report that went through 3 rounds of review. But in science, they're jokes. But they're not funny when they're holding back climate policy by misleading the public. How does this happen? Well, the media is trained primarily in political reporting, in muckraking, and that's fine. If you get the Democrat, you are obliged to get the Republican. It's also true in Europe. You get the Christian Democrat, you get the Social Democrat. But science is not bipolar. It's not end of the world and good for you. Those are the 2 lowest likelihood outcomes. It's got all these outcomes in between, and what we spend most of our time doing is winnowing out the relative likelihood of all these possibilities. So if you dumb it down into a he said, she said, end of the world, good for you, you create the impression of total uncertainty in science, which is not an accurate reflection of the state of the art of the knowledge community, which is we can't rule out at a 5% chance that it would be minor. We can't rule out at a 5 or 10% chance it's utterly catastrophic, and almost everything else in between, including a lot of nasty stuff, is the most likely part. That's what has to be reported. Reporters have to put perspective in the story, not some phony balance where they use a political model of reporting to report on science when science is not dichotomous in 2 separate groups.
Who's paying these people?
I think there are a couple of kinds of so-called contrarians. They're the obvious kind who work for mining and oil industries, who clearly are just hired guns, and their job is to search through the honest writings of scientists, find the uncertainties that all good scientists put in, and then pretend that those uncertainties dominate debate while ignoring the vast preponderance of evidence suggesting that global warming is real and we're partly responsible. Then there's another group which just likes to be contrarian. Remember, science operates on the basis of trying to disprove theory. So you have an idea, and then you go out and perform experiments, and if the experiment doesn't agree with the theory, you throw the theory away. They call that falsification. In fact, that's not true. That's the old 19th century way of seeing science. The kind of science we do, which is systems science, is so complex that any new study, whether it confirms or denies the basic idea, is not going to change our opinions very much, because it's going to take a decade or two before we figure out whether the data was correctly collected, whether it was analyzed right, whether it really made any difference. So there's very, very unlikely that the basic concept is going to change too much from any number of studies, yet some of the contrarians select out of context any new study that happens not to be confirming and say, you see, it proves we don't know anything, while they ignore the vast preponderance of studies which are confirming, yet we will not claim that those confirmations are 100%. They just increase our belief in the likelihood. So when the media reports them as equally credible, people are confused, policy is held back, and special interests gain. Should probably rephrase that. No, the gain part I stumbled on. Was that all right?
No, it's good. I'm going to ask a couple more questions. I'm going to ask you guys if you have any more questions about global warming. Then we're going to try. I'm just giving you a map where I'm going. Okay, so you know. Then I'm going to other questions. But I just want to get two more, and then I'll throw it to you guys again. Okay, we've covered this a little bit, but is it too late to stop global warming? And what can be done, and how quickly do we need to act?
Young people get very frightened, and they ask me, even when I talk to elementary school kids, but I heard it's too late to do anything about it, and the only thing we can do is try to adapt to it. Well, it is too late to stop some global warming. It's already a degree Fahrenheit warmer than it was. We cannot hold it under 2 degrees no matter what we do. Therefore, should we just give up and try to adapt? The answer is, of course not, because it's a dramatic difference what it does to nature and to us, whether the eventual warming that we end up with is 3 or 4 degrees or 10. 10 is much more catastrophic than 3 or 4. So our objective should not be to go back to where we were at the beginning of the 19th century in terms of the climate. It should be to slowly transition toward a sustainable world, and then over the century after that, bring it back down toward where it was. It's much better to warm up only 2 degrees in 100 years than 3 degrees in 50. And we can make a substantial difference in staying off the larger, more dangerous warmings, but we will not make that difference without policies to provide incentives to get there.
In your opinion, do you think we're going to change, knowing what you know politically and culturally, what's going on in this country and around the world?
I get asked often by senators, am I optimistic or pessimistic? And I have a very short answer. Yes, I'm optimistic and pessimistic. Let me start with the optimism. When an ozone hole opened up over Antarctica in 1985, there was a pitched debate over whether we should be banning those ozone-depleting substances, chlorofluorocarbons. The industry fought it, and they denied the science, just like we see with global warming. The ozone hole was a media tipping phenomenon that made it politically safe for legislators and administrators. Remember, it was the Reagan administration went along with the protocol that banned most of the ozone-depleting substances. And that's the good news. When we act, when we have clear evidence, we do something. The trouble is we don't have a climate hole. Is Katrina it? Is the heat wave in Europe in 2003 that killed 30,000 people, an unimaginable catastrophe in rich countries, it? Yes, it was it for the Europeans, but it didn't have much bump over here with our media or with our politicians. Katrina has gotten people's heads to turn that maybe we do have a climate problem. So once people perceive that already the 1 degree warming has negative side effects, and then they think, well, wait a minute, we're going up to at least 2 and maybe 4 or 6. Maybe that's not a place we ought to go. Let's figure out how we can slow this down. Did I answer it fully?
Yes, great. It was beautiful. Do you guys have anything else on global warming?
Is it true that if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, they would continue to warm for another 50 years?
If we were to hold our greenhouse emissions fixed at the current 7 billion tons of carbon we dump in the atmosphere, that will not stabilize climate. Because there's an imbalance between the amount of CO2 that's removed by the oceans and by the ecosystem and the amount we're injecting in smokestacks. So if we held the emissions fixed, which is unimaginable economically and politically, at least for the next 20 years, then we would still slowly build up to a doubling by the end of the century and go beyond that. We have to do more than hold our emissions fixed. We actually have to reduce them. We're going to increase them for a while. Remember, the developing world has not yet gotten its wealth. We used the Victorian Industrial Revolution with sweatshops and coal burning and internal combustion engines to get rich. We are now a factor of 10 richer than many of the poor countries like in India and China. And despite their dramatic economic boost, they're still way behind us. We use 10 times more energy per person than China. And we have to expect there's going to be a continued increase in emissions and in carbon dioxide, and that's going to raise the stakes. So the objective should not be to cut it tomorrow. The objective should be to invent the technologies, the political institutions, and the political will so that as we go through the next generation, we stop growing. Reverse, by the middle of the century, we're down to half of our current emissions. In fact, the state of California has said it'll cut to 80%. It'll be tough to do, but I think it's a good objective. And then we have to go to near zero by the end of the century. And that difficult job requires us to do things very differently than we're doing, and it's still double CO2. And doubling CO2 still has risks. So we have our work cut out for us. That's the bad news. The good news is we have a few decades to really get on with it. It would have been better if we started a few decades ago because then we'd have a head start, it would be cheaper. But to delay and delay and delay in order to maintain market share for special interests who happen to be in control of the White House and much of the Congress now is only going to make it harder on us, harder on our children and grandchildren, and much harder on nature. So we need to get on with this job. Is that what you wanted? Yes, Gauntlet. Continue. I run the first one. Next. He gets one too. Mike guy doesn't just sit there silently. I mean, it's got to be a producer. You got to be a producer like everybody else. There's no union, right?
Right.
We've been talking about this already, but a little bit more about the what we have to do in 2 generations. So do you think we are able to change? Is massive change possible? You were talking about we have to change in 2 generations. And if we don't, I really need a little more detail on what that 10-degree catastrophic scenario looks like.
Well, if we're lucky and people interpret the horror of the Gulf Coast in 2005 and the horror of the heat waves in Europe in 2003 as finally signals of things we don't want to do, then we have got to have agreements like the Kyoto Protocol. It doesn't have to be precisely that. There's the McCain-Lieberman bill. There are a number of things in front of Congress. We cannot solve the problem by volunteerism, as the administration has asserted. That would be about as effective as expecting to lower the carnage rates in the highway by having traffic lights and speed limits unenforced by police. You have to have rules or people don't act. And we have many, many examples of how rules have actually made us more efficient. The conservatives are all the time telling us that, our air is cleaner, except for greenhouse gases. That's mostly true. That didn't just happen because we had a Clean Air Act, because we forced reluctant industries to have to do it. And we were told how it was going to bankrupt the economy. It didn't even come close to bankrupting the economy, and it reduced our health risks and our health expenses. We have to do the same thing in climate. Now, this isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take a generation or two to transform energy systems, to build the popular support, to get people to stop thinking that big, heavy, and fast is cool. You have to start thinking that sleek, light, and efficient is cool. And that's a value change. And in fact, I'm counting on our value leaders in the entertainment industry and sports, and hopefully a few honest politicians, of which there are some left, to go out there and help be opinion leaders on getting us to recognize that our super overconsumption habits are not only not necessary, but they're actually harmful. And that's all part of the needed change. We can take a generation to do it at some cost. We'll have to adapt to a larger amount of climate change. But if we just bicker and do nothing, that's worse than a slow start where we build into that slow start the capacity for a major transformation away from conventional energy, at least over the next 50 years. We have got to cut our emissions by 50% by the middle of the century and to near zero, or we will more than double CO2. That is not controversial and speculative. That is widely accepted in the scientific community. What's controversial and speculative is how fast we should do it, who should pay, and precisely what instruments should we use to provide incentives for people to get cleaner and meaner and greener.
All right, that was good.
Next one.
That was good.
All right, so we had the wagons, we had the sword. What are you? The lance? Yeah.
All right, this is
The
humanity.
bioweapon. Right.
Do you think humanity is threatened directly? Are we going to survive if it goes to 10 degrees? I mean, are humans still going to be on the planet, or are we just wiping ourselves out?
I can say on the are we going to drive ourselves to extinction that I'm a raging optimist. I don't think there's anything that humans can do in the foreseeable future that will drive us to extinction, even a nuclear war. While an unimaginable, horrendous catastrophe that would drive civilization to extinction, there are going to be wanderers and tribes and things. We're very hard to get rid of. We're like the cockroaches. We're tough. That's not our standard. It's not whether we drive to extinction. Our standard is we have 6 billion people moving up to 9. We want to improve their standards of living, their quality of life, and reduce their footprint on nature. We're going to knock out 50% of the rest of species in order to have us just richer. We have to find ways to do our growth sustainably. That's the important objective. I don't think we will drive us anywhere near extinction, but that should not be the criteria. The criteria should basically be how much of nature will survive, what will the quality of life be, and what will the distribution of the benefits of life be. And for me, and I'm speaking personally now, in my value system, I value most the beauty and the diversity of nature and culture. And I don't want to see us into a homogenized culture of super consumists. Let me say that again. I don't want to see us as a homogenized culture of super consumers. Everybody is in the fast track to wealth. Our primary forests, reserves, and parks get destroyed. Our biodiversity goes down. We have high-risk events with hurricanes and so forth, and we rationalize, oh, well, it's only $100 billion damage. The GDP grew $200 billion, so we're okay. And that kind of attitude to me is not the sort of world that I think a lot of people want to live in. And this is not about economics. This is about fundamental values of how you want your world to be. And what are you getting for that development? We're getting to be 500% richer 2 years sooner in 100 years. That's not worth it. Let's get rid of the climate problem and get richer a little slower.
That was a gem. That's a cut, like right there. Okay, isn't this difficult? I know. It's his whole.
By the way, I can't reframe this. I try. I give this speech every time. I have the data. I have the models. I cannot get them to pick up. They talk in Carl Sagan-esque billions and trillions, and now it's a trillions of dollars, and they forget to tell you it's a trivial fraction of the growth rate of the GDP. And we have the numbers. We've published on it. I give speech. You know George Lakoff? He says you got to frame it. How do you get people to change the frame? They hear it over and over and over again on Fox News, with their fair and balanced oxymoron.
Yeah, don't think of an elephant or whatever that book.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go back to
8 minutes on tape.
okay, 8 minutes left on this tape. So
We've got 2 zingers left in this tape.
yeah, 2 zingers.
I better be my zingers better be better than 4 minutes each. It's her questions. That's the trouble. No.
You've touched on a little bit about human psychology, but we're staring at a terrible future if we don't change. What in human psychology do you think is operational? Is that work that prevents us from doing the right thing?
My ecologist friends tell us that we evolved to run from the saber-toothed cat. We have fight or fright or flight, and so we're short term. But that's not the only thing. We have this amazing dichotomy up there. It's not just fight or flight. It's not just fright, but it's also think. We have the capacity to invent our way out of problems. We have deep feelings for both nature and for disadvantaged people who are the ones who'd be hurt primarily, at least initially, by climate change. And we have the capacity to think how to get out of it. We even have the economic resources to get out of it. So we have to fight that internal battle in our brain between the primitive response, which is me first right now, and that higher function, which is what's good for my kids, what's good for nature, what's the right thing to do. And it's up to us with good leadership to try to pick the things that we think are more moral and stop asking economic questions, which in effect really are very trivial anyway, because the economic costs of this entire thing, both in the costs and the benefits, are still generally below the growth rate in the GDP. This is an ethics problem. This is about sustainability and about what we want to preserve in the earth, much more so than costs and benefits. And there are people who will try to fool you with the trillions of dollars this will cost, and they won't tell you that there are hundreds of trillions of increased consumption coming down the line, and it's a small fraction of our growth rate. That's the reframe again in another way.
There's another.
Gosh, I don't know this.
I didn't use 4 on that, did I?
Just how about,
All right, we got 2.5 more.
I'm gonna just jump around because I know
Do what you
some
want.
great zingers here and there. What did the rise of the corporation do to nature? Are shareholder values to blame for the destructive nature of the corporation? And is it possible?
I can do that, and I can do that in 6 minutes.
Okay.
I talk to corporate boards all the time because the book on the street, especially the environmental community, is these are just greedy guys and all they want is consumers and people to buy their products. And while that's true for some, it's certainly not true for all. And even the worst ones have some members of their board who think that what happens to their kids in nature matters. So I was at a corporate board the other day and I asked them, so what drives you? How do you measure success? And they all said the same thing: growth of the company. I said, well, where'd that come from? They said, well, it's always been growth of the company. And I said, well, don't you think if you go back to the Victorian Industrial Revolution, that the idea of growth was because that increased economic growth was going to be spread at the bottom of society as well as, the robber barons, and it was going to make us better off, that growth was not an end, it was a means. It was a means to improve quality of life. But what happens when that growth uses things it dumps in the atmosphere to the point we're building up to serious climate change or pollution or causing cancer from emissions of bad chemicals? Then the very basis for which we had growth, namely improved quality of life, is now in fact harmed by that very growth. Somehow in the last few decades in business school and the MBAs that these CEOs have, they were trained that the object of their business is growth, as if that were an end. It's not an end, it's a means. And we flip the ends and the means, and if we can get the end back, quality of life, then we have to look at the contradictions, because the wrong kind of growth reduces our quality of life, and we have to retake that back. And it's very difficult for corporations to do that alone. We need rules at a government level, and what makes it fair for the corporations is when everybody has to do it equally, because then they all have the same opportunity without any one particular one getting an increased market share. And that's what we need to do, but we haven't got a government right now with the guts to do that. Am I looking okay? I guess I'm sort of looking at the corner of the
Have you
thing.
noticed I've been looking at the floor? It helps. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I've sort of been looking in the corner. Right? Sometimes I look at the top, sometimes in the corner. I guess it doesn't matter, does it?
Your eyeline's great.
Okay.
It's a little borderline. There you go.
Okay.
Which is borderline? Which way should I be looking?
Are we-
More up?
No, you're
Oh,
good. The minutes on tape is
3
borderline.
minutes. Let's just
3. All right, I can. Ask me a short one.
Okay, well, can human beings handle powerful technologies like nanotechnology and nuclear energy? What's your thoughts on that?
There are people who think exotics like nanotube solar or nuclear technology or fusion 100 years from now can solve the problem. And my view is let's do some R&D and find out. Can we handle it? I'm a little bit worried about nuclear accidents and waste, but the technologists have certainly got ways to get around that. The problem is they haven't gotten ways to get around it at a cost-effective means, but let's give them a shot at it. We certainly have to invest substantially in getting the renewables improved, more efficient, and cheaper. And to claim that that's a government subsidy and it's unfair, come on, we subsidized nuclear, coal, and the conventional stuff for 100 years. Now it's the turn to take a look at the renewables so that we can level the playing field and perhaps invent our way out of this problem.
That's good.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to get tired of sitting on this, so
All right,
let's go.
talk about globalization and neoliberalism.
There's a big debate having nothing to do with climate change directly about globalization, export of our jobs over there. On the other hand, over there also needs to work. Those people have to come out of poverty. It's all part of their development. And at the same time, we don't want to waste money. We want to keep our product prices reasonable. The problem with globalization is like any other thing which has elements of a good idea is if you don't have some constraints to make it fair and safe, then it can be worse than nothing. So if you're going to have sweatshops and you're going to have people who aren't enforcing environmental standards in their products, then that globalization has got a problem. So I wouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, oh, let's go back and do everything domestically. Let's go back to trade protection, because that's not going to improve the environment or the economy. But at the same time, let's not give free rein to the financial interests to do it any way they want. We need to have some planetary standards of greenhouse emissions, of minimum health standards, of the safety of the workplace. And I think that there should be punishments for people who don't follow those rules, whether it's in the form of a tariff or some kind of international inspection, just like we do for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. They're inspectors. People don't follow rules just by volunteering. We have learned that since the Greeks started writing about it in their tragedies. And as a result, if you want to keep the institutions which improve the economy, like globalization or neoliberalism as they call it in Europe, then you have to set up some fairness rules and some environmental safety rules at the same time, and maybe we can get a compromise that both sides can live with. In fact, let me say one more thing about that. One way that globalization can be helpful to the climate change problem is in everybody's cell phone. You know, here's this little thing, and we love to talk. How did we get communication in the rich countries, in Europe and the United States, Japan? We spent 50 years stringing copper all over our continents. Well, the Chinese are doing that, but much slower. They've actually leapfrogged right over the Victorian Industrial Revolution to high tech. They have cell phones, and that improves their economy at relatively low energy use. So what we have to do is get China and India and Indonesia and Brazil and places like that not to repeat what we did with large internal combustion engine cars and coal-burning power plants and polluting systems, but let's leapfrog over to the combined cycle natural gas, to renewables, to efficient use, to small personal vehicles and much more mass transit, neighborhood planning, the kinds of things which are kind of difficult to do now that we've already developed places like Los Angeles and London on the model that we have that's not very efficient. So we could use globalization to our advantage if we could transfer those technologies that make more sense at reasonable prices to the Indias and Chinas as they develop rapidly. And in that sense, globalization could actually be helpful to the environment. But it won't happen without rules, it won't happen without international agreements, and it won't happen without policies.
That's great. I was just going to speak to the desires of consumption.
Okay.
Desires of consumption that come with globalization. But that's okay. We don't have
And that's a good way to handle that.
Go ahead.
Didn't we get into this problem because humans have a gene, which we've had as far as we know, as long as we've been around? Nobody's identified it yet, but I like to call it the greed gene. We have to own more. We have to look cool. We have to be ahead of our neighbors and our friends. We have to be better. By the way, we also have an altruism gene, and we have a caring about nature and our loved ones and the posterity. So we have to constantly balance this tension in our own head between that private greed and that caring about the collective and about other people and their lifestyle. So getting that put together is important. And the best way to do it, in my view, is to do well by doing good. What are the things that we can do that allow us to live better in the standard way of consumption, like using energy and transportation, but don't require coal burning to produce the electricity or a 6,000-pound vehicle to drive us around? So let's look for the win-wins. Let's look for ways that we can have some of that consumption that seems to drive the primitive part of our brain, and at the same time have it much more efficient and much more fairly distributed and environmentally protecting, which is that left part of our brain that says, wait a minute, we got to be sustainable as well as greedy.
I have a couple more questions,
All right.
and then you guys can keep at it.
Yeah,
But I have I'm going to ask you this, even though we've touched on it, but E.O. Wilson talks about the bottleneck in the carrying capacity of the Earth. Do you see a bottleneck? Do you think we'll lose billions of people? Do you see the sort of bottleneck of colliding forces of population, global warming, not just global warming, everything coming, sort of perfect storm of challenges?
There's two catastrophist types out there. There are the rapturists who see great catastrophe and they go to heaven, and then there's the ecologists who see great catastrophe and we all go to hell, but we don't really believe in it. And I think they're both a little off the edge. And there are warning signs out there that if we continue to not get along with people, if we insist on our way, our values, our religion, our way of life, then we create tensions in the world. And unfortunately, this is a world that's got 6 billion people heading up to higher. And it's a world that has weapons of mass destruction, though not in Iraq, but it has weapons of mass destruction in other places, and it has people willing to die for passionate causes without thought to who they're hurting. And that happens on all sides. That's not a very safe world to be in. So I have concerns about that. And if we're only hell-bent on increasing our numbers and our standard of living at breakneck speed without concern to what we do to nature, then the holocaust to the loss of species becomes a real issue. And that's what worries the ecologists, is that 1 or 2 generations of humans now, so concerned with consumerism and upward mobility, don't mind on whose nose their heel is planted as they're climbing higher and higher. And we could slow that down only a little bit and preserve a lot of nature. So I'm not a catastrophist, but I see unbridled concern with either the religious forms of Armageddon or the ecological religion that we just can't fix it and it's all going down the tubes. Both of them as being extremes that are not helpful for the kinds of negotiations that we need to have people learn how to compromise, live together, and try to have nature left at the end of the day.
My last question is our time capsule question. If there was a time capsule 100 years from now, this is a statement you're going to say to people 100 years from now. I'm going to make a little time capsule.
What would you say?
What would you say to them about how you're feeling about our prospects right now?
We're going to leave the world richer, but we're going to leave you biotically more impoverished. Hopefully, the current efforts will eventually have sufficient political clout that the wealth we leave you, while diminished slightly, will be way, way overcome by the improvement in the quality of our life and environment that will come out from fairer and safer technologies and our attitudes toward the earth. Which of those are we going to get? The legacy of wealth but destroyed environment? Or the other side? I don't know. I'm just going to work as long as I'm alive to try to get it to have less damage as we continue our pursuit of wealth and increased numbers, because we can have a little of both, but not forever and not at the cheapest path.
Right. So my question is okay, the person who hopefully goes and pays $10 to see this movie in Kansas City, and they watch this movie, what can we say to them in the movie, or what can we say to them as they're leaving the movie about what they can do?
Very good question. Okay, very good question. When I do call-in shows in talk radio or on TV, very often somebody will call in and say, I'm really interested in wanting the world to be a better place. I care about my kids. I care about preserving my farm. I want the world to be better. I also have to pay my bills. But what can I do? I can't negotiate with the Chinese. I'm not a diplomat. My students say the same thing. I can't negotiate with the Chinese. I said, you can't now. Maybe in 20 years you can. So what can we do individually? Well, the first thing we can do is set an example and mean it. If you tell your kids that you should flip the light out when you walk out of the room and shut off your computer, and you're out there idling your car for 15 minutes on the driveway in order to get the air conditioner on or the heater on, that doesn't send a message that you're telling them the truth. It says you're a hypocrite because they're supposed to do it, but you're not. So what we have to do is the old rock song. We have to teach the children well. And the best way to do that is by example, by doing it for ourselves. So if we're going to plan trips downtown, because we have shopping, we got to pick up the kids and so forth, do we have to make 4? Supposing we thought for a few minutes, maybe we could make 3 or even 2. And maybe one of them could be on a bicycle or on mass transit. These can be done with proper planning. When we go downtown, do we have to have an 8,000-pound vehicle to go do that? If we live in the mountains, we're worried about snow and driving on back roads? Sure, fine. A utility vehicle is necessary if you're a farmer or you're a rancher or a construction worker, but it isn't necessary for a single commuter in Los Angeles. And that's part of the problem. We have to look in the mirror and say, are we doing all we can to maintain a decent quality of life at the same time we are not imperiling nature and the future? And that requires us to make these decisions about being a smart consumer, not wasting. When we remodel our house, it might cost 10% more to get a really efficient window. And it might cost another couple of $100 to really super insulate the house. Well, people say, well, I don't know if I want to spend that money. Don't say that. Say, what's the payback? How long is it going to take me to earn back that extra $1,000 or $2,000 I invested? Most of the time, when you're doing energy efficiency in your home, you're going to get that money back in less than 10 years. You can't get that at a bank. You can't get that buying government bonds. That is a safe, wonderful return on investment that's also helping nature. Do well by doing good. Get smart. Be a good consumer. And finally, when the politician rolls around and says, oh, I'm going to improve the economy, not enough. Say, how are you going to improve the economy in a sustainable way that doesn't postpone the damage to the future, to nature, or to the poor people of the world?
Doing well by doing good. I'm so happy you said that.
I probably said it earlier, but I don't remember
No,
whether it
you
was,
didn't. I'm so
whether it was
glad.
offline or online.
We're done, I think, right? Anything else?
You mean you aren't going to do more on me? I can't believe this. I mean,
An hour and a half.
this whole thing for one burrito?
Nine
I mean, yeah.